Good morning. Sorry. Well, it was a bit louder than I expected. But in fact, it was effective. So thank you very much for being here. And I'd like to address my first words to you, the audience, to this session. My warmest welcome in the name of all the people present in the table, the speakers and the chairs of this panel. But afterwards, what I would like to say is a warm thank you to the organizers, to Professor João Carlos Espada and his team for providing this opportunity for us all to meet around this incredibly interesting and challenging topic, China and the West, in this also amazing Estoril Political Forum. Last year we met online through Zoom. It was not the same thing. And although we are now wearing masks, at least we will be wearing masks most of the time, the simple presence, the feeling of being together changes everything. And I think this is going to be, again, an unforgettable gathering of brains and around this extremely challenging topic, China and the West. This has been growing, has been gathering a growing attention and becoming the center of debate. And this is about the new challenges that are faced by liberal democracies in what is, in fact, the subject of the relationship between China and the West, the topic of the session. In fact, what we are probably going to discuss this morning are the issues surrounding the question asked some time ago by one of our speakers, John Owen: is China shifting the world order? And I think that from what I saw from the very broad outlines of the participations today, this is really the core of the question. We are lucky and grateful to have with us to discuss these issues four of the foremost specialists in the field, one of whom will be joining us later through a video presentation. He's in California and he's not going to be able to be present, but we are going to listen to him online. The other three speakers are here, and I'd like to thank them very much for the availability to be here to discuss with us China and the West. And they will be introduced to you by the two chairs that I'm very proud to present. On my left-hand side, Guilherme de Oliveira Martins, who is already a presence in this Estoril political Forum, as well as José Pena do Amaral on my right-hand side. Just a couple of words about our chairs, because there is so much we could say about them that we would take most of the session just to give you the bare outline of their curriculum. So I'm just going to say the minimum. Guilherme has a degree in juridical and economic sciences. He is a doctor honoris causa for at least 3 universities, and his present positions are trustee of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. He's the president of Grand Council of the National Center for Culture, chairman of the Fiscal Council of Caixa Geral de Depósitos. He's a university professor at the University of Lusíada and the University of Lisbon, and he's a correspondent member of the Portuguese Academy of Sciences and a member of the Portuguese Naval Academy and a member of merit of the Portuguese Academy of History. And he has written extensively on different subjects, several subjects, always focused on the main and deep issues of culture. And he always brings very innovative and original and relevant positions to the debates he chairs or participates in. And José Pena do Amaral is an economist and currently serves as advisor to the Executive Board and is a member of the Social Responsibility Committee of Banco BPI, Portugal, and a member of the Strategic Committee of Fundação La Caixa in Portugal. José Pena do Amaral is a former member of the board and executive board of BPI, a very well-known bank, former advisor of the President of the Republic for European Affairs, and former professional journalist and international correspondent. So thank you very much, José, Guilherme, and our speakers. And I'm going to give the floor to Guilherme for the presentation of our very distinguished speakers. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Louisa. We are friends since many years. So, and thank you also to the Estoril Political Forum. Since the beginning, and João Carlos, thank you very much because your friendship and your conference. Speaking about China and the West, we are speaking on the central theme of the moment. That's why I have the great pleasure and honor to present James J. Carafano from Heritage Foundation, Washington, D.C., to speak about this momentous theme. Thank you very much. James, you have the floor.
Thank you. I am so honored to be at this conference. I'm particularly honored to be and excited to be at any conference that begins with a reference to James Bond movies or films in general. I have to tell you, though, I took a completely different assessment away from the latest James Bond film. I don't think it presages a transition to structured solutions for dealing with global problems. I actually think it's the opposite. You know, in the old days, not just James Bond films, but American films in general would feature the danger du jour. So it always reflected the nature of geostrategic competition. We're never going to see a James Bond film that talks about competition with China, because it's not just that they're afraid of alienating the Chinese market, they're afraid of alienating the Chinese government. I take that as an issue of great concern, an issue of self-censorship, and a symbol of a problem, not presaging good things. And I also think if you look at James Bond films, they actually don't lead popular culture. They desperately try to reflect popular culture. They're like the kid that really wants to be popular in school. And popular culture is a bit of a fantasy. And I don't think it's where we're going to look for serious solutions to the problems that we face today. So I'm going to talk about one of the dimensions of relationships and engagement with China, and that's the military component. And I want to focus on what I think are the really important things to understand. The first is, I think it's incredibly important to understand the Chinese strategy, how they intend to achieve their strategic goals. And it's essentially a strategy of winning without fighting. Now, why did they pick that? Well, of course, it's great to draw on the Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosophy. There's a bit of pride and chauvinism there. But of course, the strategic situations are completely different. This was Sun Tzu wrote in the age of the warring states, and his admission to not fight was because states were weak. And if you engaged with one enemy, another enemy would take advantage of you. Of course, China is not a weak state today. It's a powerful state. So why would it want a strategy of winning without fighting? Well, there are a couple of obvious reasons. One is they don't want a major violent confrontation with the United States. Billions of people would die, including Chinese people. So there's no real advantage to fighting a real shooting war. But I think the other is that China looks at the world today and thinks that it can make marginal incremental gains, that it can rely on nations to defeat themselves through self-weakening, and through that incremental process over time, it can achieve its strategic objectives. And I think Taiwan's actually a really good example of this. I don't know about here, but in the United States, after the flyovers, we had the innumerable articles about war over Taiwan was just around the corner. I don't think that's true. And the question was asked yesterday, would the United States fight for Taiwan? I don't think that's the right question, because I don't think that's the issue. The Chinese strategy is to intimidate Taiwan, to not to have them commit to independence, to have the United States marginally back off, and then eventually I think their plan is Taiwan will fall the way of Hong Kong. The war for them would actually be a failure of strategy. So what does this mean in terms of looking at the relationship between China and the West? And I think the key thing is how important it really is to understand the Chinese motives, goals, and both their signaling and their actions. Because on the one hand, we don't want to overreact. I think people who are preparing for a war with China tomorrow are completely misreading the situation. I don't want to underreact either, because trying to pretend that there is no threat to Taiwan's independence, there is no threat to the freedom of Taiwan, I think actually is enabling and empowering the Chinese to actually take more malicious activity. So getting that balance of assessment right is the crucial strategic task today. The second point is the nature of how to look at Chinese military power. The Chinese have a concept of civil-military fusion. They don't make distinctions between military power, economic power. They view this all as instruments of the Chinese Communist Party, all to be used together and in synchronization. So if you think of the traditional correlation of forces that we use with Russia, measuring tanks against tanks, it's completely inadequate here. I think actually the hypersonic test that they did the other is a really good example. It's exactly like a Sputnik moment in the same way. When the Soviets launched Sputnik, it was not a demonstration of leap-ahead technology. It really was designed for public relations effect. They even denied that it was actually had any military implications. But they wanted to demonstrate that their technology was advancing, the West it was weakening, they were playing it for propaganda value. That's exactly what the Chinese are doing. The US is developing hypersonic weapons, the Russians, nobody's gonna have a leap ahead in this. It is dangerous, but it's not a game changing, and the Chinese are playing it for propaganda value in exactly the same way, including denying that it's actually a military test and claiming it's just space exploration. So what does this mean? I think what's important for us, look, we can talk about structural solutions and elements of power and everything else, but in great power competition, the single greatest safety net and the guarantor of stability is a robust US strategical and conventional deterrence. And I think that will be the key ameliorating factor in the pace that this competition emerges. And taking the accelerating military competition off the table, not through the notion that's not how we're gonna have arms control or force reduction or anything else, but essentially knowing the Chinese cannot leap ahead, I think that is absolutely vital. And the third point I'll end with very quickly is, when I say win without fighting, it doesn't mean that the Chinese won't fight. Of course, they're gonna do some fighting. They already have. They've traded, fist fights with the Indians, sink a fishing vessel here and there. The Chinese will not be averse to using military force, but they're going to use it in a calibrated way. And I think actually where we're going to see this play out is in an expeditionary capability. If you look at Chinese military capabilities, they're definitely building that out. Why are they doing that? I think it's to police the Belt and Road, both to intimidate potential people that get out of line, and I think we will see the point when China is confident enough where they might actually do military interventions on the fringe of their empire in order to enforce their will and intimidate the rest of the world. How do we deal with this? This is very, very important for Europe. Strategic autonomy is not a realistic notion. I mean, if you look at Europe's only real hard strategic threats, they're Russia and the spillover of things to the Middle East. Europe doesn't have the capacity on its own to deal with either of those. So in hardcore security, the only security really comes from the transatlantic community. But there's a place here for China as well, both for NATO and the European Union. I think the Chinese influence is not a direct military threat, but NATO and the European Union need to make sure it doesn't have military implications in their backyard, either from undue political influence, which would break up EU or NATO solidarity, or from interfering in infrastructure or denying ports or supply chains, which might undermine the ability of Europe to conduct self-defense. So there is a role for both the EU and NATO in making sure China is not a problem. So I'm just going to end with this, because you often hear this line. I've heard it in Europe, I've heard it in Asia. It says, when the two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. Right? The problem with that analogy is, it sounds like the answer is, let's just not be there, and then we won't get trampled. But the reality of competition with China is, if your attitude is we're going to be neutral and we're not going to get trampled, it just means that you're going to get mowed by the Chinese, because the Chinese don't accept neutrality as a real issue. They see neutrality as a target. And I put it this way, and I'll end on this comment. I mean, fundamentally, for all our differences and disagreements, we believe in three things. We believe in human rights. We believe in freely elected governments. And we have a fundamental faith in the free enterprise system. The Chinese system doesn't believe in any of those things. And in fact, they see those things as impediments to the expansion of their power and influence. If we, whoever we are, if you want to call us democracies or anything else, if the countries that cherish those fundamental values and competencies don't band together and protect them, then they'll always be under assault. And then we all might be the grass. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Professor John Owen from the University of Virginia with an important reflection on international themes. And that's why thanking you very much because your presence here. Professor John Owen, you have the floor.
Thank you, distinguished host and chairs, colleagues and students, and thank you to Jean-Carl Spada and Bill Hasselberger, my transatlantic colleague. Thank you all for coming. My remarks are about China and international order. That is to say, how China's ruling party is trying to shape international order so that it no longer favors constitutional democracies with market-based economies, but instead comes to favor its own regime, which it calls socialism with Chinese characteristics. The famous international order that the United States, Great Britain, and others set up after the Second World War deliberately had a liberal democratic bias. It was designed to protect democracy in core industrial countries after the traumas of the 1930s and early 1940s, the Depression, fascism, and communism, and of course the World War. So we often call this the liberal international order. It was a concrete application of the Atlantic Charter, which we're celebrating at this conference. It took the form of international rules and institutions, and also a new role for the United States as what John Eikenberry calls the liberal Leviathan. Early on, this liberal international order worked via what some call the embedded liberalism of the welfare state. From the late 1970s, it shifted to what some call neoliberalism, a less regulated type of economy. In any case, the order worked very well for several decades. It did help preserve liberal democracy in Western Europe, North America, and Japan. It played a role in the end of the Cold War and the downfall of Soviet communism. It has not worked so well in recent years and is in need of reform. That's a topic for another time, not my topic for today. China, since the 1980s, has moved more and more deeply into this liberal international order, although it has never been at the center of it. And China has done very well indeed by entering this order. Its rise, spectacular rise, is due in large part to its joining the international trading regime, becoming an exporting juggernaut, accepting lots of foreign direct investment, although under restricted terms that allow for technology transfer. But the Communist Party's leadership is keenly aware of the liberal bias of the liberal international order and wants to get rid of that bias. As long as the party insists on keeping in place China's domestic regime, which entails a monopoly on power by the party, the liberal international order actually handicaps China and humiliates it as well. We can think of the international order as an environment that, in evolutionary fashion, selects for certain domestic practices and traits in countries, just as a natural environment selects for certain traits in organisms or populations. And just as in the natural world, organisms sometimes manipulate their environment to the point that they alter the traits the environment selects for, just as animals sometimes actually can steer evolution in a different direction, states can steer this kind of domestic regime evolutionary pressure in a different direction. That, in fact, is what the United States did after World War II. It decided to abandon its relative isolation and to manipulate the international environment so that it would select for liberal democracy, at least in industrial countries. It was evident that in the 1930s, the international environment had selected for authoritarianism. In the late 1940s, the United States sought to change that. Now, seeing international order in this co-evolutionary way helps us see the dilemma the liberal international order has forced on China. If any state is really going to maximize its growth, influence, and power under this order, it needs to become a liberal democracy. If you're China and you defy this pressure, you'll be, to some extent, handicapped. You might never actually catch up to the United States, at least in terms of international influence. International order, in other words, is not neutral with respect to how countries order themselves domestically. What do I mean by the international environment? It's complicated. It includes international rules and institutions. It includes other states and their relative power and their regime types. And it includes information, particularly about what policies and institutions work and which ones do not. In my remaining time, I'll take these quickly in turn to discuss what China is doing in this international environment. So start with rules, and I'll focus on human rights. Human rights are not just symbolic, not just words. Deng Xiaoping, after the Tiananmen Square massacre, was surprised at how long Western sanctions lasted on China after Tiananmen Square. He concluded that maintaining China's domestic regime while remaining open to the world was going to be very difficult. Deng insisted, over the protests of some colleagues, that China could still do it. It had to hide and bide, as the saying goes. And when China got more leverage, it could then go out and make changes to the international order. So China has been doing this, has been working with like-minded countries such as Russia and Iran to sap the United Nations' ability to do individual country reports on human rights. It's working to alter international human rights norms so that they say that national sovereignty is a precondition of human rights and that the right to development comes first. China is doing similar things in the realms of cyber governance, international trade, and so on. So that's international rules. Second element of the environment, other states, how much power they have, what their regime types are. China is exporting authoritarianism in very subtle ways, not by using force or covert action to overthrow democratic governments, although we need to keep our eye on the Taiwan problem. Beijing, though, is exporting technical know-how and technology to government officials, helping them sustain single-party authoritarianism. Particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's providing authoritarian governments with surveillance hardware and training and techniques. Employees of Huawei, the company, by far the biggest exporter of surveillance technology, are reported to have aided security officials in Uganda and Zambia to track regime opponents. 36 out of 86 Belt and Road Initiative investment recipients have received artificial intelligence surveillance infrastructure from China. Third, information, that is information in the international environment about what policies work, what domestic regimes work, which ones help governments get what they want, a stable polity, a growing economy, security from internal unrest, the ability to handle crises. China has been putting into the environment information that authoritarian capitalism in the 21st century is the superior domestic regime. It gets things done quickly. It is meritocratic, that is, it puts the best people in charge of public policy without the accidents and mistakes of democracy. It fosters sustained economic growth. It boasts great engineering achievements. It makes for a stable political system. It crushes COVID very quickly. And by the way, it enables a single party to stay in power forever. And a great deal of political science literature shows that elites in different countries pay great attention to which domestic systems work better and which don't. So here, from a global perspective, we have not only a contest over the future of Taiwan or access to the South China Sea, we have a contest over the content of international order itself. International order is not just about increasing cooperation among states or lowering transaction costs or improving the information environment. It really is also about which domestic regime type will dominate. And to get more precise, an authoritarian international environment would handicap liberal democracies, including in Europe and North America, pressing them over time to become more authoritarian. The theme of this conference is structuring a new alliance of democracies. We can quibble about what alliance means, but it's clear the democracies do need to pull together more closely again, as they have in the past, to face an old threat to their cherished systems of government that has taken a new and subtle form, a shift in the international environment that has nurtured and protected democratic free market institutions in Europe and North America, but that is being modified by China's ruling party so as to select for authoritarianism. This does not mean seeking a new Cold War with China, but it is imperative that democracies do come to a consensus soon about saving the liberal international order, reforming it so that it protects democracy once again. The stakes are high for all liberal democracies, regardless of which side of the Atlantic they are on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor John Owen. Now I give the floor to Martin Ayer. He is a very well-known sinologist from Prague and is founder and director of the non-profit institute Academia, and is and its flagship project Synopsis. Martin Ayer, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, and thanks for having me on this panel. I have to admit I haven't seen the latest James Bond movie, so I think I'll skip that topic and go straight to the issue at hand. And I would like to start with focusing a little bit on the language that we use when we frame the issue of, or the challenge of contemporary China. This session that we're all attending now is titled China and the West, but I think that the issue is actually much larger and doesn't only concern the West. China as a challenge, of course, relates to much wider audience, so to speak. And we could probably argue that even before the West realized there was this challenge coming from the People's Republic of China, many countries in Asia were already struggling with it. For example, Japan, well, first and foremost, of course, Taiwan, but also Japan and India, to name a few. And the policy changes in the United States in its relations to China were actually preceded by some very important policy changes in countries like Australia, and the policy shifts in Australia to a large extent have actually informed the changes in the United States and preceded it by about at least a year. So it's not just the West, it's also the East. You know, Japan has the word East in its very name. The South, again, Australia has the South in its name. So it's essentially, it's a challenge that is now before the whole world, not just the West. Now, related to that is some of the terminology that is used in the US and Europe in framing this whole issue. In the US, the main term that we hear very often is, and we've heard it here already, is great power competition, which I would argue is probably not the best way to frame it, certainly not outside of the United States, because it seems to imply that the problem is just a power struggle between the two great powers, the two superpowers. It might actually turn off some potential allies. So I would probably advise our American friends to use it not very much outside of the United States. I think the European language, the European term systemic rivalry probably is more fitting to the whole problem, because that's indeed what it is. It's a contest between two systems, between two different views of how the society should be organized, and indeed how the whole international system should be structured. Another term that we hear quite often is some kind of a new Cold War. So, some people use it, some people criticize it. Can we talk about the new Cold War? Of course, we don't enter the same river twice, so the situation today is very different in many significant ways from the Cold War. Not least because after about a quarter of a century of unbridled globalization, especially since China joined the WTO in 2001, the two systems, the two competing systems or rival systems are so intertwined that it would be very difficult to imagine the kind of the Cold War confrontation that we had before 1989. Yet, as the French say, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So there are certainly elements that are reminiscent of the old Cold War. And first and foremost, the one element that comes to mind is exactly the systemic difference between open societies and a Leninist political system that governs the People's Republic of China today. I think, when we talk about the Cold War, the new Cold War, or a new Cold War, we look at it from the Western point of view. I think it's actually quite useful to try and look at it from the Chinese point of view. And there has been some significant theoretical thinking on this issue in China. And as a matter of fact, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping himself, has some interesting ideas about how the situation today, not only in relation to the outside world, but also inside China itself, relates to the Chinese past, especially to the period of Chairman Mao Zedong. So essentially, Xi Jinping divides the history of the People's Republic of China into three phases. The first one is the era of Mao Zedong, when China was guided by the right ideology, but didn't quite have the right tools to actually implement this, correct, orthodox Marxist-Leninist line. So it failed. So by the end, Chairman Mao died at the end of the Cultural Revolution in 1976. China was on the edge of a collapse, both politically and economically. So in comes the second phase, led by Deng Xiaoping, who introduced reforms that were designed to save the People's Republic of China from collapsing, and also to a certain degree to make sure that the kind of, to make policy changes that would guarantee that the kind of tragedy that was the Cultural Revolution would never repeat itself. So Deng Xiaoping loosened the social controls, he loosened the control over economy, and the result was the quite impressive economic rise of China that we have witnessed in the last few decades. So that was the second period. The third period is Xi Jinping's own. He calls it the new era that he declared at the 19th Congress in 2017. And basically, he's saying that his period is a kind of a synthesis of the two previous periods. So he would like to go back to the original intent, as he calls it, the Chusin, the original Marxist-Leninist policies, the orthodox policies of Mao Zedong era, but at a qualitatively new level. That has been enabled by the economic rise of China and also by the fact that now China has at its disposal all these new technologies like big data, artificial intelligence, that actually make it possible to achieve what could not have been achieved under Chairman Mao Zedong and what actually failed in all of the Leninist countries worldwide. So basically centralized control of the economy and centralized control of the population. It never really worked. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. It didn't work in the Eastern Bloc because the right tools were not available. But General Secretary Xi Jinping believes that now he has the right tools, so he can go back to these the original intent, to the original policies, but at a very different level from Chairman Mao Zedong. So when we look at things from this perspective, we could probably argue that globally we are actually heading also to kind of a synthesis of the Cold War and the globalization that the unbridled globalization that followed it. It's going to be some kind of a mixture that will combine both of these elements. I think I'm running out of time, so maybe I would just make one last comment, and that is that I think that the current situation that we're facing with China basically stems from the changes in the 90s, from the fall of the Eastern Bloc, after which much of the world took it for granted that it's a general historical rule that these the undemocratic regimes eventually would have to fall almost by themselves, and liberal democracy would triumph. So for about a quarter of a century, the outside world didn't really pay much attention to what was happening in China and didn't really take it into consideration that back in 1989 or 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed, we actually did leave behind a Leninist power that would eventually come back to compete with the liberal democratic order. And back it did come, but back it has come, and not only it has returned, but it has returned at this qualitatively new level, armed with not only a very strong economy, but with all these tools, digital technologies that make it possible for China to increase its domestic control of the Chinese population, but also its influence internationally. So that's, I think, how we got where we are right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are now see a video from with a message from Chao Kang. He's a research scientist at the School of Information and the founder and editor-in-chief of China Digital Times. Is activist of the human rights and is recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship.
Okay. I'm very honored to be part of this panel to participate in important discussion about China and the West today. The main theme I would like to present for everyone in this session is about the rise of Chinese digital authoritarianism and its impact to, well, really to the globe, but in this particular session between China and the West. The West, I broadly describe as a set of countries, whether United States or Europe or Northern America or other Australia and even Japan, in the sense of those more developed democratic institutions, the nation. The main trend we have seen in the last 10 years goes together with the rise of China's economy and China's digital economy particularly, including the very pervasive, vast, robust infrastructure building on the digital communication information technologies. Together with this rise of those economy and the technological field, China's political control taking advantage of such technology. In other words, the use of digital information technology by Chinese Communist Party to surveil, to repress, and to manipulate domestic and even foreign populations, becoming a loomingly large threat. Of this, we can start from current Chinese Communist Party's General Secretary Xi Jinping's leadership, which under him was driving towards a censorship, propaganda, even AI, big data-driven, population-wide surveillance. This comprehensive, full-spectrum nature of Chinese digital surveillance state, which include, but not limited to, the massive propaganda apparatus, wide array of other organizations, including internet service providers, data analytic companies, and social media websites, all contribute to the internet censorship and digital control of citizens in China. And this also includes Great Firewall, which is a subject that I have given intense attention and study over past decade. This is a collection of software and hardware systems used to monitor and filter communication on national internet gateways. The Great Firewall not only surveils, but intercepts and blocks internet transmissions according to the official requirement of different Chinese government agencies. It also blocks foreign internet tools and mobile apps and forces foreign companies to adopt China's domestic regulations. So in general, this growing state of surveillance, censorship, disinformation, I call the rising of the Chinese digital authoritarianism, has many dimensions. Just give you an example. Right? China uses high-tech censorship systems and official media reports, as well as social media platforms such as Weibo, WeChat, LETV, to increase not only internal ideological propaganda and disinformation, but also external, meaning outside of China's border, in the West, in many, many other countries, to manipulation of Chinese nationalism and to sort of changing the narratives and deliberately guiding people to forget history or reconstruct a narrative that would fit into China's both domestic and foreign policy goal. This kind of fight in the information space is increasingly large, but they also goes together with China's another international foreign policy a large goal, which is we call the digital Silk Road. And we already know the Silk Road project, or the One Belt, One Road project of China, which is very, very large, extending so many countries in the world. But this digital Silk Road is part of that general Belt and Road project. 65 countries are being identified by Freedom House's Internet Freedom Report in 2020 that participating such large scale of the projects, which is China become a supplier of illiberal governments wishing to deploy their own surveillance system. And there are companies such as Hikvision, CloudWalk, citing facial recognition technology using artificial intelligence in many countries, from Egypt to Qatar, but also Southeast Asia, to many democratic countries in the West. So this leads me the next important theme, which is we are actually living in an age, what I call the great digital contest. This great digital contest is really between the democratic countries, which view information as an empowering force in the hands of people, a free and open flow of ideas and news, opinions, and that will fuel the deliberative democracy, and authoritarian systems, which China was at the center driving about it, but it's also empowering the other authoritarian state. And of course, Russia is also a participant on that trend. Those authoritarian systems to see the information technology enhanced information flow, what I described, as a threat. They viewing information as a danger in their regime and something the state must control and shape. So with the technology capacity, China and the rising Chinese digital authoritarianism is exactly shaping that space, not just within China, but in the general information space globally, right? So now the world is entering the era of artificial intelligence. As technology currently relies on the centralization of massive data. That's what AI does. Then the AI tends to empower centralized autocratic government rather than decentralized democratic governance. And this is a really looming issue between China and the West. And this is what I call the great digital contest. Because China is already the richest, most powerful, most technologically advanced dictatorship. Using surveillance, censorship, manipulation of information, the Chinese Communist Party shore up its power at home while weakening democratic competitors abroad. So if we don't do things effectively in those democratic countries, then by 2030, artificial intelligence-based surveillance system that China will develop and export to the world will enslave 75% of the world population unless we are taking some strong actions to address this challenge now. Right? We're talking about those systems will be 7 days a week. Every citizen is monitored 24 hours a day to monitor their every action by those type of technology and equipment if we let China to export that kind of technology to the rest of the world in the current speed. So I'm just going to finish sort of my general presentation to say the rise and the global expansion of China's digital authoritarianism is reshaping the balance of power between democracies and authoritarian state. So China has provided the world with a blueprint for the establishment of digital totalitarian state. All democratic states and civil society actors must work in solidarity to counter the global expansion of Chinese digital authoritarianism, to defend and preserve freedom and dignity in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have some remarks from Giuseppe Neduamelot.
Thank you. First of all, my warm greetings to the panel and to the audience. I think I should give up my remarks because we don't have so much time, and I think it would be a pity if the audience wouldn't be able to raise some questions. So I suggest that we take, let's say, 3 questions from the audience. Please be as concise as you can. And then the panel would answer and wrap up. because there is no conditions for a real debate, a classical one. I think the host is also in agreement with this, and my colleague Guilherme. So the floor is yours. I'll take the questions. There's one here. Another one there, and there is a last one to be taken. It's okay now. So please. I'm sorry to...
Very much for all your excellent presentations. My question is about something John Owen mentioned, but others may also want to comment. And he briefly mentioned COVID. And I was wondering, when I heard that comment, to what extent do you think Western governments' responses to COVID may have boosted the Chinese regime's claims that authoritarianism is the good way to get things done? Thank you.
John, I think that it would be better that we take the three, and because then you will have time for a final comment, all of you. So, the second one, please.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Vidi. I come from Jagiellonian University, and as one of the few Asians here, is very thought-provoking and yet eye-opening presentations coming from all Western panel, actually about, talking about China star democracy. Basically, my question is almost the same with the first question. It's about COVID and then the China-style democracy. Since we know that Mr. John Owen previously talked briefly about human rights, and we can differentiate here individual respect to the individual human rights, and also the Chinese-style respect to collective human rights is yet proven more effective in COVID handling. And do you think Western-style democracies that are previously in the COVID handling situations, such as for example, having a frictions between mask enforcement, mask mandate, and the burqa ban, for example, do you think Western-style democracy is kind of like irrelevant within the time of crisis? Thank you.
Thanks a million, Konstantin Agat. My question is to Mr. Carafano. And it's about the US-UK, Australia new alliance. Do you think, what would you recommend, let us say, as urgent steps as the most urgent steps to solidify it and to make it more than just a declaration, apart from the Five Eyes security cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, following the plan, I would like John to answer the three questions and, if possible, to make a final comment on this issue. Then I'll give the word to the other members of the panel.
Okay, very good. I'll answer the first two about COVID. This is, yeah, Andre, this is an empirical question. You're asking about the China's impressive ability in containing and defeating COVID, not defeating, we never defeat COVID, I suppose, but handling it so impressively, and what are the effects of that on China's, the reputation, the international reputation of China's regime, as well as the domestic reputation within China. I recall what Carl Gersman said yesterday, that the virus, with almost 100% certainty, came out of China. So that's not good for China's reputation. And not just that it arose there, but that China mishandled the virus so egregiously during the first few weeks and allowed it to spread out into the world. That's just bad for China's reputation. On the other hand, China since then has done remarkable work in defeating it domestically. And so I don't know how this comes out, actually. I think it's something to watch. I'm interested in how Europeans view the matter. I'm quite interested in how Asians view the matter, and Africans, people in elites in countries. So I pay attention to elites in countries that are semi-democratic or transitioning between democracy and authoritarianism and can go either way. These are the ones that are most changeable, most impressionable. I have to think, though, if I had to bet, which thankfully I don't have to do, but if I had to, I would bet that China comes out looking pretty good to a lot of these elites, that this is a system. These emergencies are going to come. They're part of modern life. There will be more pandemics, and there'll be other emergencies we can't even foresee. We don't have the imagination to envisage yet. And if I'm an elite in a less developed country, I'm going to be pretty impressed with how China has performed. Now, this gets to the second question about human rights, and right here. Yeah, so there are I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is, I do think Western, I don't want to say Western, open, liberal democracies are better at a lot of things. So who came up with these mRNA vaccines quickly? It was not China. China came up with a vaccine, but it's not the high-tech, innovative one that's going to pay dividends for the entire world for a long time. That was Europe and the United States, private enterprise, under the market incentives under which they operate, right? It's remarkable what happened when these economies with their technology focus their attention on a big problem. This is what can happen, right? On the other hand, notwithstanding the fact that everyone here is masked and so on, in my country, I don't know, half of you at least would not be masked, I think. So I think it's a rule of thumb. Liberal democracies are not as compliant with state authority as certainly Chinese are, and there are lots of reasons for that. And it might be that that's one thing that liberal democracy's not as good at handling public health crises quickly. There are trade-offs in any question like this. What regime would you rather live under? And on the whole, I still say liberal democracy, but I have to concede that it might be that liberal democracy is not as effective at handling this. On the other hand, it's good to recognize that there are different types of liberal democracy. So I spent much of the pandemic in Canada. Liberal democracy, to be sure, in the province of British Columbia. There is a greater trust of authority and much greater compliance with masking norms and with vaccination requests and so on. Nothing's coerced there apart from on buses and so on. It's much like the United States, but there's more, the culture is a bit more compliant. They pay a price for that. Canadian culture is more compliant, and it misses some elements that you find in the freewheeling United States. So again, trade-offs. But my point is, even among the liberal democracies, there's variation in how they've handled the pandemic, and their infection rates and their hospitalization rates and their death rates. So we need to pay attention to that as well. And as for human rights, I would just really hesitate to let emergencies like this fundamentally alter the way we think about human rights. I think that would be a grave mistake.
Thank you. Well, maybe Martin now?
Sure, thanks. Well, I think the difference in handling the COVID crisis between China and the democratic world quite vividly demonstrates the systemic difference that we have also talked about. The first instinct of the top-down Leninist system is control. You have to control everything, including information. And that's how the crisis even erupted. Because if the Chinese authorities didn't suppress the information about the crisis in the early phases, we probably wouldn't have a pandemic today, right? So that's one thing. In the liberal democratic world, the top-down control is difficult by definition. That's not how the system is designed. So the response is free flow of information and innovation, and that's you know, that's what the West did. It didn't really control the populations very well. The populations in democratic countries tend to be rather undisciplined. But there is this great pool of innovation that came up with the vaccines. So, you know, that's, you could argue that ultimately the response in the West has also been quite efficient from this point of view. I think when you talk about, and actually in China this is often discussed, which system deals with the crisis better, you know, there's different ways of looking at it, and also different phases of the crisis to emphasize. So if you emphasize the early stage, how the crisis was even created, you could argue that the Leninist system didn't do very well. It actually helped create the crisis. But if you focus on the later stages, you could argue both ways. So you could argue that the social control that is inherent to Leninist system works very well in this kind of crisis situations. But then you could also argue that in the long term, you know, the ultimate answer to the virus really is vaccination, and on that count, the liberal democratic countries, the liberal democratic systems seem to have been working better. Thanks.
Thank you. So finally, James, if you would like to comment, please. We have some time.
Oh, thank you, Konstantin, for the question. So for those who are not familiar, it's the US, Australia, UK deal to produce nuclear submarine capability for Australia. You know, we should say that this deal was inevitable. The deal with France was inevitably going to fail. The French were missing both on cost and delivery. And so the deal their deal was doomed anyway. And Australia's strategic needs have evolved. They need nuclear submarines as opposed to diesel submarines, much quieter, incredibly more survivable, and can stay deployed way longer and go much greater distances. It's a much more significant capability, and would be a much greater concern to the Chinese. So to go forward, the U.S., Australia, and Great Britain actually have to deliver on a capability, and that's not as easy as it sounds. That's important both because it would be militarily significant in the balance of forces in the region, but also it sends an incredibly powerful political signal to the Chinese, and the Australians have actually been the global center on this, and the willingness to stand up to the Chinese. So I can't overstress the importance of this moving forward. It doesn't negate the importance of other European nations in the region. And I'm not one who thinks that there's a role for the EU and NATO in out-of-area operations in general, particularly not in the region, but individual nations can bring a real capability in stability and prosperity in the Pacific. You know, actually, particularly the French. The French are actually the ones with the most interest, the most capability in the region, and their participation is actually the most important. And there, I think, are some others as well. But it's national contributions. But this actually gets to the bigger issue, which is national contributions to the competition with China are incredibly important, especially actually with medium and small nations. You know, even in the United States, and you think this as well, we talk about this pivot to Asia, like we're all going to rush to Asia, and that's where we're going to deal with our concerns about competition with China. This is like the police rushing to the bank, you know, after the bank robbers have left. The competition with China is global, and it cannot be matched just in the Indo-Pacific. And so nations that share the common commitment to human rights and freely elected governments and the free enterprise system, they have to be prepared to compete globally. And individual European nations, I think, have a very significant role to play in that in many theaters. You know, Portugal, for example, is deeply influential in Latin America and Africa, both areas where I think Chinese activity has been incredibly destabilizing and threatening, and where partnership with other like-minded countries is really, really important. So there's a very broad role. Like I said, I think for the EU and NATO, their role is in collective security in Western Europe and doing the things to make sure that the Chinese cannot put their finger on the scale there. But I think individual European nations have a significant role to play in partnership with other European nations, with other Asian nations, with the United States, with Canada, in many places around the world. And I think that's where the dialogue needs to rapidly move to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Surprisingly, we are 5 minutes ahead of time. So I had the idea to ask all the participants to summarize in 1 or 2 phrases what they think we should keep in mind in this debate, China and the West. Maybe John could start.
Sure. Well, picking up on something Martin Holla said, China and the West is, for me, fundamentally not about great power competition, though that is an inescapable component of it, certainly for the United States, for my country. But it's more fundamentally about the future of democracy and democracy's ability to thrive in the 21st century. I think this is a serious problem that we need to face together and make sure we don't fall victim to the efforts by Chinese and Russians, more pointedly, to divide the West. That it's easy to be divided. These are divisive times, but I think there's a lot more at stake than just the issues of the day. I think there's a long-term, slow-moving pressure that's building on democracies to become more authoritarian. We need to recognize it and push back against it. Thanks.
Thank you, James. Now and then back to Martin.
Sure. I want to end with a commercial. I think the most important tool that we bring to dealing with the competition with China is transparency. The more that we understand about what the Chinese are actually doing and what their intent actually is, the more intelligent decisions that we can all make. So at the Heritage Foundation, we have something called the China Transparency Project, where we try to bring together people that are doing the best open source research from around the world and collate that information so it's readily available for everyone. So we have a website on this. We have 100 international partners, and we're always looking for more. We also produce an annual report, which you can find on the website, the China Transparency Project. So we divide Chinese activity in 8 different areas, everything from climate and energy to foreign direct investment, to human rights, to domestic issues. And we try to highlight what's the really good research that's available. We grade the level of transparency, and we talk about trends and what you can do with this information. And so we really encourage this kind of partnership. We think it's really important. What's really fascinating about this is an incredibly dynamic field. When people produce really good open source research on China, the #1 customer is the Chinese Communist Party. Because they want to know, how did you get that information? Because they want to figure out how to shut that off. So it's incredibly how many times we'll talk to researchers who said, well, we went to the local sites and found out the local budgets, and from there we determined how much money they were spending on detaining Uyghurs, and then we used Google Earth to find the buildings, and we estimate the thing. And then they said as soon as we published our research, we went back and all those sites had been wiped. So this is a really dynamic struggle between us and the West. We need lots of partners, we need lots of attention, lots of focus, because getting to the reality of what the Chinese are actually doing rather than what we'd like to think we want them to do is so super important. So highly encourage you folks to join our effort. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Martin, you have the privilege to close, please.
That's right. So yes, just a very quick summary. Like I said, I think the best way to frame the current situation is the term that the European Union has been using, the systemic rivalry. And I would add that to a very large extent, it's a legacy of the unfinished aspects of the last Cold War. So there's some resemblance to that historical era, but the current confrontation will be very different because it's happening at a qualitatively new level. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the invisible hand allowed us to keep the schedule. I give back the floor to our distinguished host, Louisa.
Well, thank you so much for all the contributions. But before we finish, I would like to take upon me to stress another point that was made within this session, which I think is incredibly important for the future, and it has to do with the rise of the digital surveillance state. So I think this also should be taken into account as a part of our final recommendations for further thought. After this, and thanking you all again, I have a message just to say that the Thucydides Society Garden Session, as the name indicates, is going to take place in the garden. I think that we are going to have a short coffee break, if I'm not mistaken. And so before we gather in the garden, thank you so much again, and have a wonderful rest of the session. Thank you so much.